Newport, summer of 1897. On Bellevue Avenue, where fortunes shine brighter than the ocean sun, a laundress's daughter walks alone, clutching a bundle of flawless linens, her only shield against a world that refuses to see her. One runaway carriage, one torn parcel, and one scarred magnate later, everything changes. In front of the grandest mansion in the city, a man whispered about as a monster kneels beside a woman, used as a servant, and a choice is born. Obey the life she was given, or risk everything for the life she deserves. Tell me, from where are you listening to this story, and what do you love most about historical romances? Newport, Rhode Island, summer of 1897. The season when wealth gleamed brighter than the sun over the Atlantic, and the grand mansions of Bellevue Avenue rose like marble monuments to pride. A world of privileged elegance and ruthless gossip, where a person's worth could be determined by the fabric of their dress or the grandeur of their name. Alisson Whitcombe did not possess grandeur. She did not possess much of anything. Her fingers, reddened by steam and lye, clutched a bundle of freshly pressed linens wrapped in plain cloth. The parcel was warm against her palms, the steam seeping through as if trying to escape the harshness of the world just as desperately as she did. Her dress was a faded shade of blue, though one would never guess its original color. It had been mended so many times that the stitches formed a map of poverty across the thin fabric. A worn apron hung crookedly from her waist, spotted with the ghosts of soap and toil. Yet she walked with quiet grace. A grace that had nothing to do with fine parents or dancing lessons, but with endurance, a sort of fragile dignity that refused to be broken. The sun gilded the rooftops as she hurried along the wide avenue. Horses and carriages rushed past, wheels clattering sharply over stone. The wealthy strolled under parasols, shaded even from blessings of the sky. Alisson kept her gaze lowered, never daring to meet their eyes. She knew what they would see if she tried. A girl whose life had been spent serving and being scorned, treated as invisible even by those who should have loved her. Her heart raced with each step, not from the weight of the delivery, but from fear of returning home late. Margaret Whitcombe did not forgive delays. She did not forgive anything. The memory of her mother's last outburst, hands slamming against the wooden table, sharp words slicing deeper than any blow, lingered like a bruise across Alisson's spirit. She walked faster. The Pembroke mansion loomed ahead, its grand facade rising over terraces of manicured hedges and white stone pillars. It was known as one of the most impressive residences in all of Newport, and yet many whispered that its master, Gideon Pembroke, was its darkest secret. A widower with a ruined face and a ruined heart. A man no society lady dared marry, no matter how immense his fortune. Alisson tried not to think of him. Her task was simple: deliver the parcel, return home, avoid trouble. She reached the iron gate and hesitated only a moment before it swung open, pushed gently by a liveried servant who barely looked at her. She murmured a timid thank you, though her voice was almost lost to the rustle of the breeze. Then it happened. A horse, startled by the whip of a sharp gust, reared violently. The carriage driver shouted, but the frenzied animal bolted toward the gate. Alisson froze for only a heartbeat, but the wheels were already upon her. The world tipped, the ground vanished beneath her, and then thunderous pain. She hit the stones with a cry that died before leaving her lips. The parcel burst open, snow-white linens scattering across the dirt like fallen purity. Dust clung to them greedily, staining everything she had worked so hard to perfect. Gasps rose from the passers-by who stopped to stare. Not a single hand reached for her, not a single voice called her name. She tried to push herself up, but dizziness washed over her. Her vision blurred, shapes gathering above her like faceless shadows. And then one figure separated from the rest. Tall, broad-shouldered, his shadow fell over her as if protecting her from the sun itself. Gideon Pembroke. She recognized him instantly from whispered descriptions. The man feared for his scars. The man mourned for his past. Society pointed at him with elegant gloves and arrogant laughter, calling him a monster. Yet the voice that reached her was rough velvet, steady and low. "Do not move. You may be hurt." His gloved hands, large and shockingly gentle, hovered near her wrists before touching her skin with careful reverence. His face came into focus. The left side bore the handsome features of a nobleman, strong jaw, refined cheekbones. The right side revealed the harsh truth that society mocked, a web of scars, raised and twisted, reminders of flame and tragedy. His eyes, steel blue and intense, studied her not with disgust, but with concern. "What were you thinking, letting her wander so near the road?" he demanded sharply, not at her, but at the carriage driver. Alisson blinked, stunned. No one had defended her like that. No one had cared enough to shout on her behalf. I am fine," she whispered, though her voice trembled and pain throbbed through her arm. He looked at her as if he could see the truth beneath the lie. His hand brushed a strand of chestnut hair from her cheek, trembling slightly, as if uncertain whether he had the right. "You are hurt," he said. "Your courage does not change that." She tried to gather the scattered linens with shaking hands, but he stopped her with a quiet command. "Leave them," he said. "I mustn't. My mother." Her throat tightened. She could not finish. His gaze softened, the hard lines of his scarred face shifting into something unexpectedly tender. He lifted one of the linens from the dust and regarded it with a furrowed brow. "These were meant to represent wealth and elegance," he murmured. "Yet they lie on the ground, ruined by the very ones who value them most." She swallowed hard. Shame burned her cheeks. "I will fix them. I have to." "No," he said again, more firmly. "You need rest and care. Let me help you." Help. The word felt foreign, dangerous, precious. The crowd watched, their whispers curling like smoke. Why does he care? Who is that girl? What is she to him? Their murmurs grew crueler with each breath, yet Gideon did not rise. He remained kneeling beside her, making himself vulnerable in a world that would mock such humanity. With careful strength, he helped her stand. She tried not to wince, but the pain betrayed her. His arm wrapped around her just enough to steady her trembling legs, and her heart leapt in confusion. She had never known the safety of another's hold. "I will take you inside," he said softly. "Let my physician examine you." She stared at him, lost in the storm of emotions that swirled in his eyes. Anger at her suffering, worry for her health, fear of what he could not yet name. "But, sir—" "No arguments," he interrupted, voice rough but kind. "You are under my care now." The wind lifted the ruined linens and carried them like defeated flags across the road. Alisson's breath caught. It felt as though her entire life, every stitch, every tear, every humiliation, was scattered there beside them. Gideon saw her anguish before she could hide it. "They are only linens," he murmured. To him, perhaps, to her, they were survival. Clinging to the last scrap of courage she possessed, she met his gaze, truly looked at him for the first time. His scars did not frighten her. The sadness beneath them did. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in that instant, it was the most powerful sound he had ever heard. "Thank you." He inhaled slowly, as if her gratitude pierced through armor he had forgotten he wore. For the first time in her life, someone saw Alisson Whitcombe, not as a burden, not as a servant, but as a young woman trembling at the edge of hope. Gideon Pembroke guided her toward the grand doorway of his mansion, the threshold where fate waited silently for them both. Behind them, the wealthy watched in scandalized awe. Before them, an unexpected future began to unfurl, delicate and terrifying like a flower opening under the fiercest sun. And though neither dared speak it aloud, something irreversible had happened in that single devastating moment in the street. Their worlds had collided, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first sensation Alisson registered was softness. A pillow, plump and unfamiliar, cradled her cheek. Beneath her, smooth linen sheets whispered against her skin, starched and clean, luxurious in a way she had never known. Then came the scent. Lavender water and wood polish, faint and refined, replacing the damp, iron-laced air of boiling water and bleached cotton that had marked every morning of her life. She opened her eyes slowly. The room was bathed in early light. She lay in a bed carved from dark walnut, its headboard etched with intricate scrollwork. Pale green drapes filtered the sunlight through lace panels, casting delicate patterns on the walls. A marble fireplace, unlit but imposing, loomed across from her. On the mantel sat a clock that ticked quietly, its sound crisp and measured. It was a world carved out of wealth and silence, both so foreign to her that it made her chest tighten. Her fingers clutched the edge of the sheet. She had never slept in such a bed. She had never been allowed to. Every bone in her body told her she should not be here. The door creaked open. She tensed. A tall, thin man entered, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, his spectacles glinting in the light. His coat was modest but elegant, his shoes silent over the carpet. He carried a black leather case and moved with the confident calm of someone accustomed to witnessing discomfort. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, his voice low and clear. "I'm Dr. Edwin Marshall. I've been asked to look after you this morning. You had quite the fall." She tried to sit up, but he raised a hand gently. "No need to rush. You've only just awakened." Her arm ached when she moved it. A bandage had been wrapped carefully around her forearm. Her body felt sore in places she hadn't noticed before. Still, it was not the pain that unnerved her, but the question that burned at the back of her throat. "Why am I here?" "Doctor." Marshall glanced at the window as though gathering his thoughts. "You were injured outside the Pembroke estate. Mr. Pembroke insisted you be brought inside." "Mr. Pembroke," she echoed, her voice hoarse. The doctor nodded. "He instructed that you be made comfortable and seen to immediately." Alisson looked down at the nightgown she wore, white, soft, and clearly not hers. Her eyes widened with dread. "My clothes, they were removed only for your comfort," the doctor said quickly, sensing her fear. "You were unconscious, and your garments were damp and torn. Nothing improper occurred, I assure you. The maids saw to it." A wave of relief washed over her, though shame followed close behind. Even in safety, her instincts braced for judgment. Will Mr. Pembroke be terribly angry?" she whispered. Dr. Marshall frowned slightly. "Angry?" "For the linens," she said, barely audible. Something in the physician's expression softened. "I believe Mr. Pembroke has other concerns at the moment." He closed his case and rose. "You're well enough to sit by the fire if you'd like. Lady Eleanor has asked to see you once you're ready." Lady Eleanor. The name felt distant, royal, ungraspable. Alisson nodded, her voice caught in her throat. The doctor left, and after a moment a maid entered, a young woman with red curls pinned neatly beneath a white cap. She smiled, kind but reserved. "If you please, miss," she said, setting down a folded gown on the armchair. "Lady Eleanor said this would be suitable." Alisson stepped out of bed slowly. Her legs trembled, less from pain than from the fear of being seen in a place she did not belong. The gown the maid handed her was simple but beautiful, a soft rose-coloured day dress with narrow cuffs and a modest neckline, the bodice fastened with small pearl buttons. It was far more refined than anything Alisson had ever worn, and her hands shook as she dressed. Downstairs, the drawing-room was quiet, filled with the soft ticking of another ornate clock. Shelves lined the walls, heavy with books in deep mahogany tones. A bouquet of pale roses sat in a crystal vase by the window. Lady Eleanor Pembroke sat near the fire, wrapped in a deep green shawl. Her silver hair was pinned into a crown of twists, and her eyes, though ringed with age, were bright and piercing. Alisson hovered in the doorway, her heart beating far too fast. "Come in, child," Eleanor said. Her voice was gentle but firm, like a teacher who still believed in tenderness. Alisson stepped forward. "Sit with me," Eleanor offered, gesturing to the chair across from her. "You must be quite overwhelmed." Alisson obeyed, her hands folded in her lap. "Yes, my lady. Thank you for allowing me to stay. I won't trouble you long. Nonsense. Eleanor waved a hand. You were injured, and you've been treated poorly for too long, I suspect. Alison's eyes widened. She said nothing. I'm not blind, Eleanor added softly. I know a young woman who has learned to flinch when kindness is offered. Alison's throat tightened. For a moment, the firelight blurred. We are not a household that casts people out for being poor, Eleanor said. We do, however, expect honesty and a willingness to heal. Can you give us that? Alison nodded, not trusting her voice. Good. Then you'll stay. Eleanor reached for a small bell and rang it once. Within moments, a servant entered with a silver tray bearing tea and toast. Alison stared at the porcelain cup set before her, her fingers trembling as she lifted it. You are not expected to serve here, Eleanor said with a quiet smile. You are expected to breathe. That afternoon, Alison was shown to a smaller sitting room, where she was told she could read, rest, or take needlework if she wished. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and lavender. A piano stood in the corner, silent and perfectly tuned. She wandered through the space, unsure what to do with so much stillness. Her entire life had been movement, scrubbing, silence filled with commands and chores. Here, silence held no threat, only possibility. In the evening, she was taken to a modest guest room adjoining Lady Eleanor's quarters. The fire crackled, casting amber shadows across the walls. She sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers brushing the hem of her borrowed dress. Then a knock. She rose, startled. The door opened slowly. Gideon Pembroke stood on the threshold. He had changed from his frock coat into a darker waistcoat, his cravat slightly loosened, his hair still neatly combed, but touched by the fatigue of a long day. The scar on his face caught the firelight, a jagged path of memory and loss, and yet it was not the scar she saw. It was the way he looked at her, with hesitation and gravity, as if her opinion held weight in a world that never asked for it. I hope you're feeling better, he said. Yes, she whispered. Thank you. He nodded, then paused. I hope you'll allow me to offer you shelter for a few days, until you've healed. No obligation, no expectation, simply rest. Alison's breath caught. It was too generous, too dangerous, too kind. He watched her for a long moment. You don't need to answer now. Take your time. She opened her mouth, closed it, then managed, I cannot return home tonight. His jaw tightened. Then stay. Their eyes locked. Not with romance, not with bold declarations, but with something rarer. Trust forming where none had ever grown. She nodded once. He inclined his head, then turned to leave, pausing only briefly before closing the door. In the silence that followed, Alison sat by the fire, her fingers resting in her lap. Outside the mansion walls, Newport whispered. Already, rumors would be spreading. The scarred magnate had taken in a laundress, the widow with a ruined name, the girl who had no place among chandeliers and carved banisters, but inside these walls for the first time she was not a servant, she was a guest. And though fear still lingered in the corners of her heart, something else began to rise alongside it, something hesitant and soft and dangerous. Hope. The Pembroke mansion, grand and echoing, seemed to hold its breath in Alison's presence. Though days had passed since her arrival, she moved through the house like a whisper, present but never imposing. The household staff, well-trained and discreet, accepted her without question, though curiosity flitted behind their glances. Some assumed she was a distant cousin of Lady Eleanor's. Others whispered of charity, but none dared speak too loudly. Not when Gideon Pembroke had made it known, wordlessly yet undeniably, that the girl was under his protection. Alison remained unaware of the speculation. Or perhaps, more truthfully, she had learned not to let awareness weigh on her shoulders. Her world had been shaped by observation and caution, and within these new golden walls she remained a creature of quiet instinct. She rose early each morning, long before the maids began their rounds. Her footsteps barely disturbed the polished floors as she moved through the corridors, carrying linens from one room to the next, never assuming she should be idle. When offered breakfast in the sunlit breakfast room, she instead slipped into the small corridor near the kitchen, where the footman sometimes ate standing. She never took more than a cup of tea and a crust of bread, always standing, always silent. Gideon noticed. He noticed how she flinched, barely perceptibly, whenever a voice rose unexpectedly in the halls. How she tensed when someone reached too quickly across a table, as though bracing for something other than harmless movement. How she averted her gaze whenever spoken to, her eyes dipping downward, not in shyness, but in learned submission. He watched from a distance, always from the edge of doorways or behind half-open study doors. She never saw him. Or if she did, she never let it show. There was a kind of elegance in her restraint, a discipline born not of refinement, but of necessity, and it stirred something in Gideon that was neither pity nor admiration, but a kind of reverence, tinged with guilt. He found himself listening for her steps in the hallway, measuring the rhythm of the house by her movements. When she passed the threshold of the library in the late afternoons, he would feel the air shift, even if he never entered after her. It was Eleanor who said it first. "She does not know how to be seen," she murmured over tea one morning, her tone neither pitying nor indulgent. Not as a person, at least, only as a task. Gideon said nothing, his fingers tightening slightly around the handle of his cup. "I've begun teaching her to read," Eleanor continued. "She pretends she already knows, but the truth sits in her eyes. She memorizes shapes, but not meaning." "She must be ashamed," he said softly. "She is," Eleanor replied. "But that will pass, if we give her reason to believe she's worth the effort." Later that day, Alisson was invited, gently by Eleanor's own hand, to sit beside her in the small salon at the back of the house. It was a quiet room, with tall windows that opened onto the rose garden and a faint scent of cedar from the writing desk near the wall. Eleanor placed a leather-bound primer on the table and, without preamble, opened it. "Start where you like," she said. Alisson hesitated, her hands hovering over the page. The letters swam before her. She recognized some, A, E, L, but the rest tangled into confusion. I can do the laundry first," she offered quickly, her voice tight. "You can do both," Eleanor replied. Alisson swallowed hard. Slowly she traced her finger across the page. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Eleanor waited. They sat like that for some time, one woman holding space, the other wrestling with the memory of shame. When Alisson finally sounded out the first word, it came out cracked and uncertain, but Eleanor only nodded and turned the page. That night, the house fell into its usual stillness. Distant laughter echoed from the servants' quarters. Wind tapped lightly against the stained glass window above the staircase. Somewhere beyond, the sea pulled against the cliffs. Gideon wandered the hallway outside the library, a habit born of restlessness. He never entered after dark, out of respect, out of memory, but on this night a sound stilled him, a quiet sob, not the dramatic weeping of a person demanding comfort, but the soft, stifled crying of someone who believed no one would hear. He approached the library door. It had been left ajar. Inside, Alisson sat on the floor beside the fireplace, a book open across her lap. Her knees were drawn to her chest, her head bowed low. A few loose pages lay around her, as though she had tried to organize them and failed. The fire behind her cast a golden halo around her figure, but her face remained shadowed by her hair. Gideon's hand reached for the doorframe, but he did not enter. Instead, he stepped back, heart aching with the weight of her loneliness. Later that night, when the room had gone dark and the embers had faded to soft orange coals, Alisson returned to collect the scattered pages. She found, resting quietly on the low table near the hearth, a new book. It was old, bound in worn green velvet. On its cover, embossed in gold, was the title, Verses for the Quiet Heart. A white flower, pressed, dried, and perfectly preserved, was tucked between the first pages. She stared at it, breath caught in her throat. No note, no name, but she knew. From that night forward, the library became a place of unspoken communion. Gideon began leaving small tokens behind, books carefully chosen, passages marked in pencil, a soft scarf once draped over her usual chair when the weather cooled. And in return, Alisson began to leave behind faint traces of herself. A wildflower tucked between the pages of a poetry volume, a neatly folded scrap of paper with a word she had practiced writing over and over again. Sometimes, when she dared, she would write his name, Gideon. Just that. No one spoke of these exchanges. Not Eleanor, not the servants, not even the wind that passed through the corridor windows, but the silence between them deepened, not into distance, but into something else, something reverent. On a cold morning near the end of the week, Gideon entered the library before dawn. He sat in the chair she favoured, holding the small piece of paper she had left behind the night before. It bore a single line, painstakingly written in her careful hand. I wish I knew how to belong to a place like this. He closed his eyes, and in the stillness of the room, he whispered to no one, You already do. He folded the paper and tucked it into the pocket over his heart. Then he stood, left a new book on the table, The Language of Flowers, and placed beside it a pressed violet. And as he walked away, the first rays of morning broke across the glass, casting golden light across the room that had become, in its own quiet way, the heart of a story neither of them dared to speak aloud. Not yet, but soon. The rain had fallen steadily since morning, draping Newport in a veil of melancholy. It was the sort of storm that silenced even the grandest of mansions, as if the world itself had lowered its voice in reverence. Inside the Pembroke estate, the fire in the east drawing-room burned low, the hearth casting a muted glow across the patterned carpet and velvet drapes. The sky beyond the windows throbbed with slow flashes of lightning, their pale blue light cutting across the panelled walls in ghostly intervals. Alisson stood near the tall window, her fingertips resting lightly against the cold glass. Drops rolled down the pane like tears from a face too proud to weep. The storm suited her mood, reflective, uncertain, laced with questions that no one had answered. Behind her, the house was still. Eleanor had retired early with a letter from an old friend. Henry had disappeared into the study after dinner. The silence was vast, yet never empty. The air in this house always held weight, of memory, of secrets, of things unsaid. She turned slightly as a faint sound touched her ear. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. She knew them by now. They belonged to no one but him. Gideon Pembroke entered the room without ceremony, as though drawn not by intention but by instinct. He paused near the doorway, his form framed by the deep oak arch, his silhouette tall and unmoving. He wore a dark grey coat that suited the storm, his cravat undone, the collar of his shirt open just enough to betray the edge of exhaustion. The fire caught the silver threading in his temples, and the lightning from outside flashed briefly across the right side of his face, the side marked by flame and grief. He did not speak immediately, nor did she turn fully to face him. Instead, she remained near the window, watching the storm, as if waiting for him to step into the space between silence and confession. Finally, she asked softly, "Do you ever miss the sound of voices?" He stepped closer. Sometimes, but not all voices deserve remembrance. Her fingers slid away from the glass. The storm makes me think of endings. He came to stand beside her, close, but not touching. Or beginnings. She looked at him then. Truly looked. His eyes were steady, pale as steel, yet darkened at the edges with something deeper, a quiet sorrow, a history kept under lock and key. She had wondered about it since her arrival, not out of idle curiosity, but because everything in this house bore the weight of someone no longer present. The nursery at the end of the hall remained closed. A small portrait in the dining room had been turned inward. Every corner felt haunted. not by ghosts, but by love denied the chance to last. And tonight, the storm gave her courage. "What happened to them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He did not pretend to misunderstand. He turned away from the window, walking slowly toward the fireplace. He placed one hand on the marble mantel, fingers splaying over the cool surface. For a long moment he said nothing. The fire popped softly behind him. "I failed them," he said at last. The words were so simple, so bare, that they trembled in the air like fragile glass. She stepped toward him, hesitant but drawn. "Who?" "My wife. My son." Her breath caught. "There was a fire," he continued, his tone low without embellishment. "In the nursery, late. I had come home late. Again, I had pushed her away, as I often did then. I thought I had time to make it right." He looked into the flames, and for a moment they seemed reflected in his eyes. "I was downstairs. I heard nothing until it was too late. The smoke. It filled the corridor before I could reach the stairs. I tried." His voice cracked for the first time. "God help me, I tried." She said nothing, for there was nothing that words could give him. Not comfort, not absolution. He turned to face her slowly, and she met the full sight of his scars, without flinching, without pity. The lightning illuminated the deep ridges and burns that laced the side of his face, the legacy of that terrible night. But it was not the damage to his flesh that held her gaze. It was the truth behind his eyes, guilt, raw and unrelenting, that no mirror could reflect fully. "They say I'm disfigured," he said quietly, "but they're wrong. The fire didn't do this." He touched the ruined skin of his face. "Not really. This is nothing compared to what was burned inside me." A single breath passed between them, heavy with what could not be unsaid. "I don't think you're monstrous," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. His eyes searched hers. "Then you're either kind or naive." "Perhaps both," she answered gently. "But I know pain when I see it, and shame. And I know the kind of silence it wraps around you." For the first time his posture faltered. Something shifted in him, not weakness, not collapse, but the release of a breath he had held for far too long. She reached for the small table near the hearth and poured him a glass of brandy from the decanter that always stood untouched. Her hand trembled slightly as she held it out to him. He accepted it, their fingers grazing. Neither pulled away too quickly. They stood there, no longer lord and guest, no longer magnate and laundress, but man and woman suspended in the hush of confession. And then the spell broke. A knock. 2 short raps at the door. Henry entered, his expression carefully blank, but his eyes said what his voice did not. "Mr. Pembroke," he said with a respectful nod. "Miss Harcourt is here." Gideon stiffened. The brandy remained untouched in his hand. Alisson blinked. "Miss Harcourt." "She asked to call, despite the weather," Henry added, subtly apologetic. "She insisted it was urgent." Gideon exhaled slowly, the emotion in his frame folding inward like a letter sealed too quickly. "Show her to the blue parlour. I'll be down shortly." Henry nodded and withdrew. Alisson took a step back, the distance between them growing not just physically, but in posture and temperature. She recognized the name. Everyone in Newport did. Lydia Harcourt, gloved in silk and ambition, her beauty as curated as her cruelty. "She'll see me," Alisson said softly. "I should go." Gideon turned to her. "You've done nothing wrong." "She'll think I have." His jaw clenched. "Let her." She did not respond. She only nodded and left the room quietly, like a candle extinguished by a single breath. Downstairs, Lydia arrived in a flurry of perfume and damp satin, her eyes scanning the hall with surgical precision. She had not expected to see Alisson descending the stairs in a pale grey gown, modest but undeniably refined. The girl paused briefly on the landing, startled by the sudden presence of society itself incarnate. Lydia's expression twisted, just for a moment. Shock, recognition, and something darker, insult. She offered Alisson a tight smile and turned away, her heels clicking over the marble like a declaration. Later that night, Alisson sat by her bedroom window, the storm having passed, but the ache in her chest remaining. She watched the clouds drift across the moon and pressed a hand to her heart. Something had broken open inside Gideon Pembroke tonight, and something had broken open in her as well. But not all cracks were meant to be healed. Some were meant to be shared, quietly, gently, like the space between two hands that longed to reach but did not dare. Not yet. The garden behind the Pembroke estate was at its loveliest in early summer, when the roses blushed beneath the morning sun, and the hedges stood proudly trimmed like silent green sentinels. Lady Eleanor had always favoured June for hosting her annual tea, a tradition respected by the wives and daughters of Newport's elite, who treated such invitations as a mark of quiet power and unspoken favour. This year, however, the event carried a different weight. It was Eleanor herself who requested that Alisson assist during the tea, not hidden in the kitchen or sent to polish silver behind closed doors, but present, visible. Dressed in a modest but graceful lavender gown with a scalloped collar and lace cuffs, her chestnut hair gathered in a simple twist and pinned with a pearl comb Eleanor had insisted she wear. She looked delicate yet composed, like a flower not plucked from the earth, but finally allowed to bloom where it had always belonged. "You are not to serve like a maid," Eleanor had told her that morning, adjusting a fold of fabric with precise care. "You are here as my companion. You may pour tea, yes, but no one is to mistake your place again." Alisson had nodded, heart pounding. Fear twisted quietly beneath her ribs, but she swallowed it with a trembling breath. If Eleanor believed she could endure this afternoon, then she would. The guests arrived with fans fluttering and hats bobbing like colourful clouds. Gowns of silk and muslin swept across the flagstones. The scent of lilac and citrus filled the air, mingling with murmurs of polite conversation. Alisson stood behind the tea table, her hands poised but still, her back straight. She did not speak unless spoken to, yet she could feel their eyes, measuring her, dressing her down in silence. Whispers brushed past her like wind. "She's the one from the laundry. Is she a cousin? No, impossible. Why would Lady Pembroke?" But Eleanor's voice rose, calm and certain. "Miss Whitcombe has been a comfort to me these past weeks. I've found her company most agreeable. She has a sincere mind and a thoughtful heart, both qualities I find far more valuable than an impressive surname." A pause, a stir among the ladies. Then Lydia Harcourt's voice, sweet and sharp as sugared lemon. "How very noble of you, Lady Eleanor," Lydia said, lifting her teacup with delicate precision. "And how very open-minded." The smile on her lips did not reach her eyes. Alisson remained still, her fingers tightening slightly around the teapot's handle. She had not seen Lydia since the night of the storm, but she had not forgotten the way the woman's gaze had slid over her like a blade. Dismissive, threatened. Lydia took a slow sip, her attention never leaving Alisson. "It's admirable, truly," she continued, setting her cup down, "to elevate those born in such humble soil. One might say it requires a great deal of vision, or perhaps a particular appetite for the unconventional." There it was, the insult wrapped in lace, the implication flung like a gauntlet onto a table of fine china. Eleanor's fan snapped closed, the only sign of her rising displeasure. Alisson, however, remained still, her face calm. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "Tea, Miss Harcourt?" she asked, her tone courteous. Lydia blinked just slightly, then nodded. "Please?" Alisson poured, smooth, unshaken. When she handed the cup over, their fingers brushed. Lydia's smile widened. "Thank you, Miss Whitcombe. You're very composed." "That's generous of you," Alisson replied. "I find that most things in life require a steady hand." The tea table was silent. And then, one by one, the ladies murmured their approval. Not loud, not effusive, but enough. Lydia's eyes narrowed. When the last of the guests had departed, Eleanor leaned against the back of a wicker chair and sighed. "You handled her beautifully." Alisson shook her head, emotion beginning to surge in her chest now that the performance had ended. "She hates me." "She envies you," Eleanor corrected gently. "There is a difference." That night the house quieted under the velvet weight of twilight. Alisson slipped outside before supper, needing air, needing silence. The sun had dipped low, casting the stables in a golden haze. She stood beneath the archway, resting a hand on the wooden post. The scent of hay and saddle oil mingled in the air. Her dress brushed against her ankles. She stared into the dark stall beyond, eyes unfocused. Behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't need to turn. She knew them by heart. "Why here?" Gideon asked softly. "It's quiet." He stopped a few feet away. "It was never meant to be a battlefield." "I was careful," she said. "I know, and brave." She shook her head, blinking rapidly. "I didn't feel brave. She tried to humiliate you, and you did not bend. That is a form of strength most people never learn." Alisson closed her eyes. "They'll never accept me." He stepped closer, but not too close. His presence wrapped around her like heat from a fire, subtle but all-encompassing. "Acceptance is overrated," he murmured. "Respect, however, that you've earned." She turned then, her throat tightening. "You can't protect me from them. Not forever." "No," he said, "but I can stand beside you." A silence bloomed between them, deep and trembling. She looked down at her hands. "When she spoke to me like that, I felt like a child again, helpless, small." "You are neither." His voice was rougher now, edged with something deeper. "Shame belongs to the ones who mock dignity, not the ones who rise from it." She stared at him, and in that moment, the distance between their worlds collapsed into nothing. He reached for her hand, slowly, gently. His fingers brushed hers, just enough to feel the tremble in them. He did not take her hand fully. He only let it rest beneath his own, warm and steady. Her breath caught. He was looking at her as if she were something fragile and sacred, something he did not dare touch too quickly. The moment hovered, held in exquisite tension, like a note at the edge of music waiting to fall. But he let go, too soon, too carefully. "I'm sorry," he murmured. Alisson didn't move, didn't breathe, only watched him retreat a single step. "Don't be," she said. He met her eyes, and in his gaze was a truth neither of them had the courage to speak. Not yet. He turned away first, retreating into the shadow of the house, his footsteps steady but heavy. Alisson remained in the stables, the cool breeze brushing her cheek like a ghost of what had just passed. When she returned to the house, Eleanor was waiting by the staircase. The older woman said nothing, only studied her with those sharp, knowing eyes. "You're not invisible anymore," Eleanor said quietly. Alisson pressed her lips together. "That doesn't make it easier." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but it makes it worth it." Upstairs, the lamps flickered softly in the corridor, and behind closed doors, whispers would soon begin again, cruel, envious, desperate. But Alisson had heard worse. And now, someone had heard her, seen her, believed in her. That changed everything. It was a morning of perfect stillness, an early summer hush that settled over the Pembroke estate like the lace veil of a bride. The sun filtered gently through gauzy curtains, and the scent of blooming roses drifted through the open windows of the drawing room. The tranquility, however, was fragile, and it shattered the moment Margaret Whitcombe stepped across the threshold. She arrived without warning, without invitation, and without shame. Her boots clacked sharply on the marble floor as she entered, her black dress creased and her bonnet askew. There was nothing humble in her bearing, only fury, veiled thinly in a smirk that did not reach her pale grey eyes. Alisson had just finished arranging flowers in the parlour when she heard the front door open. She froze, the shears slipping slightly in her hand. She would have known that voice in a crowd of thousands. It was the voice that had carved obedience into her bones, that had stolen her girlhood in harsh syllables and bruised commands. Margaret's gaze landed on her like a thrown stone. "There you are," she said, her tone more victorious than affectionate. Henry Caldwell stepped between them at once, his voice steady but firm. "Miss Whitcombe is a guest here. You cannot barge in without permission." "I'm her mother," Margaret snapped. "I don't need permission." Alisson slowly turned, setting down the flowers with hands that shook despite her resolve. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice soft but clear. Margaret's eyebrows lifted. "Is that how you greet the woman who gave you life?" "You gave me labor," Alisson answered, "not life." The silence that followed was sharp and breathless. Gideon appeared in the corridor, his expression unreadable, but his presence immediate. "What's the meaning of this?" Margaret turned to him, schooling her face into something resembling civility. "I've come to collect my daughter." "She is not yours to collect," he replied evenly. "Oh, really?" she asked, voice rising. "She is still of no means, no station and no voice. Until she marries or is claimed, she belongs to her family. That's the law." Gideon didn't move. "She is not your property." "I don't want a fight, Mr. Pembroke," Margaret said sweetly. "I only want what's fair. She was under my roof. I fed her, clothed her. You used her." Margaret's smile disappeared. Alisson stood straighter. "I'm not going with you." Margaret turned, shocked. "What did you say?" "I'm staying here," Alisson repeated, though her voice wavered. "I am not going back, not now, not ever." Margaret's face twisted, fury flaring into her eyes. "So, this is what he's done? Filled your head with lies and put you in silk so he can parade you around like a mistress in maid's clothing?" Alisson flinched, but did not look away. Gideon stepped forward, but Margaret raised a hand, turning to him with sudden venom. "You think money erases decency? I know exactly what you're doing, keeping her in this house like a pretty little secret. People will talk, Mr. Pembroke, they already are. But if you want to keep this quiet, if you want her reputation clean, you'll pay me." He stared at her. "Get out." "You heard me," she said coldly. "Pay me, and I'll disappear. I won't mention what she's done, what you've done." Gideon's voice dropped to a dangerous hush. "Miss Whitcombe has done nothing. And if you ever return to this house again, you'll find yourself escorted not by my steward, but by the police." Margaret's lips curled in a smile that did not belong to a mother. "You'll regret this." She turned to Alisson one last time. "You'll come crawling back. You always do." But Alisson said nothing. She merely stood still, her silence louder than any scream. Margaret left in a storm of black skirts and indignation, and the door closed behind her like the final slam of a coffin lid. The house remained silent for several minutes. Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes shadowed, but her spine straight. Dr. Marshall arrived moments later, summoned by instinct rather than messenger. "I'll see to Alisson," Eleanor said quietly. "The rest of you, give her space." Alisson stood frozen, her breath shallow, until Eleanor reached her and placed a steadying hand on her arm. "You did well," she murmured. "You chose yourself." Alisson blinked fast, the burn in her eyes too sharp to ignore. "She'll ruin me." Eleanor nodded. "Let her try." But ruin, as it turned out, did not wait. Within days, the town began to stir. The whispers that had once skated gently through parlours and tea rooms sharpened into something colder, crueler. Words like kept woman, charity case, and temptress slithered from lips disguised with powdered grace. A letter arrived for Eleanor, written in an elegant but anonymous hand. It warned that Alisson's presence at Pembroke House had become a stain on its legacy, that the girl from the laundry was jeopardizing what little dignity remained in Gideon's name, that further association would result in formal exclusion from Newport society. Eleanor read the letter without a word, then folded it precisely and placed it in the fireplace. "I don't keep company with cowards," she said, as the flames devoured the page. But the damage had begun to spread. That afternoon, Dr. Marshall came to Gideon's study. Rain fell softly outside the window, and the air inside smelled of cedar and tobacco. "You need to address this," the doctor said without preamble. Gideon remained seated at his desk, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. "I've done nothing to warrant it." "Exactly, and yet your silence gives their lies power." Gideon looked up slowly. "You think I should make a public declaration, parade her into a ballroom and name her my ward?" "I think," the doctor said gently, "that if you care for her even half as much as it appears, you owe her more than protection from the shadows." Gideon said nothing, but his jaw tightened. "She's not a secret," Dr. Marshall added. "Don't let them make her one." When the doctor had gone, Gideon sat alone in the growing dusk. He thought of Alisson's quiet strength, her trembling hands and steady voice. He thought of the moment she had stood between him and her mother, unprotected but unyielding. And he thought of the woman whose dignity now balanced on the blade of his hesitation. That night, Eleanor slipped into the library with a leather-bound ledger in hand. She opened it at her writing desk and began searching through records, names, transactions. It took hours, but eventually she found what she needed: forged documents bearing Alisson's name, falsified debts, promissory notes never signed, yet claimed by Margaret. She closed the book with care. "There are many kinds of ruin," she whispered to the empty room. "But truth is the only fire that cleanses." And as the rain fell against the windows of the Pembroke estate, inside, a storm of another kind was beginning to take shape, one that would not be fought with thunder, but with resolve, with revelation, and with the quiet, devastating strength of a woman who refused to be erased. The late afternoon sun draped the cliffs in gold, casting long, jagged shadows over the crashing sea below. The wind blew wild and unkind, tugging at the hem of Alisson's shawl as she stood near the edge of the precipice, her chestnut hair pulled loose by the gusts. Her heart pounded, not from fear of falling, but from the weight of words she had not meant to hear. She had not gone looking for gossip. It had found her whispered like venom behind the pantry doors, where two maids exchanged confidences they thought safe from listening ears. Their voices had been soft, but sharp. "She's only here because he pities her," one had said. "Or because he wants her," the other replied. "Men like him don't keep women like her out of charity." Alisson had stepped back from the corridor as though struck. Her breath had caught in her throat, and before she could stop herself, she was running, past the study, down the long marble corridor, out through the kitchen courtyard, and up the winding path that led behind the stables, beyond the gardens, up the hill to the cliffs that towered over the Pembroke estate, like ancient gods. The sky was heavy with sea salt clouds, the wind slapping at her cheeks, her skirts whipping around her legs. But it was nothing compared to the storm inside her. Shame, confusion, anger, not at the words. They were not new, but at how easily they had pierced through the careful armor she had begun to build. An armor woven by books and small kindnesses, by Eleanor's steady encouragement, by Gideon's unreadable gaze and the way he always seemed to appear when the world became too much. She stood at the edge and looked out, letting the raw beauty of the Atlantic crash into her senses. And then, footsteps. She did not need to turn. She knew his presence. It was not loud, but it was unignorable, solid, grounding. "Alisson," Gideon said, his voice carried by the wind but softened by concern. She did not move. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he added. "I'm not alone," she said, still facing the horizon. "Not anymore. That's the problem, isn't it?" He stepped closer but left enough distance to respect her silence. "What happened?" he asked gently. She laughed, short and hollow. "I made the mistake of listening." "To whom?" "Servants. Society. Ghosts. Does it matter?" She finally turned to face him, her eyes luminous with restrained pain. "They think I'm here because you need someone to fill a quiet house, or because I'm willing, or because I don't know better. And what do you think?" Her voice trembled. "I think I don't know who I am in this place." Gideon looked at her, his eyes searching, his expression unreadable. "I'm trying," she continued. "I study. I walk the halls without shrinking. I speak when I'm spoken to. I hold my head up most of the time, but I still feel like a child in borrowed clothing, like one wrong step will remind everyone, including myself, that I was never meant to belong. The wind caught her shawl again, and she clutched it around her shoulders. I know I'm not what they expect. I never will be. He took a step forward, his voice low. And what is it they expect, Alisson? That you cower? That you disappear? That you apologize for existing? Her breath caught. He reached for her hand, slowly, deliberately, and this time he did not let go. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm, calloused, real. When I look at you, he said, I don't see a servant. I don't see a guest. I don't see a girl who needs rescuing. She met his gaze, and something inside her stilled. I see the only person who's ever looked at me, he whispered, without flinching. Alisson felt the words settle over her like a balm and a wound all at once. You're not a burden in this house, he continued. You're not some lost creature I've taken in. You're a woman who has survived things most people would break beneath. You carry yourself with more dignity in silence than they do in all their silk and gold. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. I don't want to feel invisible anymore. You never were, he said. Not to me. The wind died down for a breathless second, and the world seemed to pause around them. She felt his thumb brush over her knuckles, not possessive, not hesitant, only present. I'm afraid, she confessed. So am I, he answered. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. Of what? Of how much you matter, he said, his voice rough with honesty, and of how much I don't know how to show it. They stood there, the sea below roaring with ancient hunger, but the space between them quiet, reverent. She let her hand stay in his a moment longer. Then she pulled away, not in rejection, but in restraint. We should go back, she murmured. He nodded, though his gaze lingered on her face as if memorizing it anew. They walked side by side along the path, neither speaking, neither rushing. The wind had softened into a breeze, and the estate glowed ahead, lit from within by golden lamps and the faint warmth of a waiting fire. As they neared the entrance, the heavy oak door opened before they reached it. Eleanor stood in the archway, her cane in one hand, her silhouette a quiet sentinel beneath the gaslight. She said nothing as they passed, but her eyes followed them closely. Inside, the house had returned to its usual stillness. Alisson paused at the base of the staircase, unsure whether to speak, unsure how to end a conversation that had left her exposed and stronger all at once. Gideon bowed his head slightly, the gesture more intimate than formal. "Good night, Alisson." "Good night," she replied, her voice soft but steady. As she ascended the stairs, Eleanor watched her disappear into the upper hall. Gideon turned to her, but before he could speak, Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "She's not the only one who needs to stop hiding," she said. He didn't respond, but something in his posture shifted. Eleanor turned and walked toward the study. Once inside, she pulled out fine stationery, dipped her quill in ink, and began writing a list of names. At the top of the page she wrote, "Guests to be invited. Pembroke House charity supper Thursday next." And beneath it, in bolder script than the rest, Miss Alisson Whitcombe, guest of honor. Because sometimes the only way to silence society was not to fight it, but to rise above it, arm in arm with the truth, and Eleanor Pembroke intended to make sure the truth was no longer something whispered behind doors, but spoken in the brightest room of the house. The Pembroke Ballroom had not hosted an event in nearly 4 years, since the fire, since the silence, since the mourning drapes had been taken down, but the sorrow never fully lifted. But tonight, Eleanor Pembroke declared the doors would open once more. Not for society's amusement, but for its reckoning. The occasion was presented as a modest charity ball, an evening gathering to raise funds for the restoration of the old library in the northern parish. The guest list was select but influential, chosen with the precision only Eleanor could execute. Wives of judges, daughters of shipping magnates, matrons of clubs and conservatories. And though the invitation came formally from Eleanor's hand, every whispered circle in Newport understood the underlying message. The Pembrokes were re-emerging, and Alisson Whitcombe would be visible. The day of the ball arrived with pale skies and a cool breeze that stirred the ivy clinging to the estate's stone walls. Inside, the servants moved with swift efficiency, polishing silver, unfurling rugs, lighting chandeliers that had not glowed since the house last echoed with music. The scent of beeswax and roses clung to the air, rich and anticipatory. Alisson stood in her chamber, heart pounding as Eleanor's maid buttoned the back of her gown. The dress had been chosen carefully, a soft shade of dove grey with subtle embroidery along the cuffs and bodice. The fabric whispered rather than announced. No jewels, no ornaments, only a ribbon of slate blue at her waist, and her hair pulled into a low chignon, a single wisp framing her cheek. "You look—" Eleanor paused from the doorway, her eyes warm but measuring. "Exactly as you should." Alisson turned, uncertainty clouding her gaze. "They'll be watching." "Let them," Eleanor said simply. "You will give them something worth remembering." The ballroom gleamed that evening, lit by dozens of candles flickering within crystal sconces. Music floated gently from a quartet near the windows, the strains of a waltz mingling with the hum of voices and the soft clink of glasses. When Alisson entered, walking beside Eleanor, the reaction was immediate. Conversation slowed, heads turned. A ripple of silence spread like a tremor across polished marble. Alisson felt it all, the stares, the calculations, the weight of unspoken judgment pressing on her chest like corset stays drawn too tight. But she held Eleanor's arm and stepped forward, chin lifted, her breath steady. Gideon watched her from across the room. He had arrived late, as was his habit. He wore a tailored black tailcoat and white waistcoat, his cravat tied neatly but without vanity. The scars on his face were neither hidden nor flaunted. They simply were. A part of him, like the shadows under his eyes or the silence in his step. But when he saw her, truly saw her, he felt the world narrow. Alisson walking through that room like light through fog. She did not see him yet. Her attention remained fixed ahead, her face composed, her eyes tracing Eleanor's lead. Then Lydia Harcourt made her entrance, late, dramatic, deliberate. She wore a gown of crimson silk that caught every candle's flame, and a diamond brooch pinned like a dagger at her collarbone. Her lips were curved into a smile that did not touch her eyes, and her presence sliced through the gathering like a blade of ice. She spotted Alisson immediately, and did not wait. "Why, Lady Pembroke," Lydia said sweetly, drawing close with practiced grace. "I had no idea your companion this evening would be so familiar." Eleanor turned. "Miss Harcourt." Lydia's gaze dropped to Alisson's gown, then rose with mock surprise. "You've made quite the transformation, Miss Whitcombe. I hardly recognized you out of your apron." The words were quiet, but those closest heard, and they passed along the circle with the efficiency of fire-catching silk. Alisson's spine stiffened. "Good evening, Miss Harcourt." Lydia tilted her head. "I do hope you enjoy the evening, though I imagine you've already enjoyed quite a bit of Mr. Pembroke's generosity." Eleanor's fan snapped open with a sharp flick, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the air. It was not loud. It did not need to be. "Enough!" Gideon had crossed the room, every step measured. The crowd parted around him, as though instinctively sensing the weight of what he carried. He stopped beside Alisson. She looked up at him, startled, but he offered no explanation, no pause, only truth. "This woman," he said, turning to face the room, "has more honor than any of you who trade in cruelty dressed as civility." A hush fell. The quartet stopped playing. Only the candles dared flicker. He turned to Alisson, his voice quieter now, but no less certain. "You owe them nothing, but I owe you everything." He extended his hand, not as a command, not as possession, but as a promise. Alisson stared at it. Her chest rose with the breath she did not realize she had been holding. Then she placed her hand in his. Gasps rippled like wind through trees. Lydia's mouth opened, then closed. Fury flared in her eyes, but it was Eleanor who stepped forward next. "I wonder," she said calmly, "how many of you would dare look this young woman in the eye if you knew the truths buried in your own homes?" Lydia stiffened. "What are you implying?" "Implying nothing," Eleanor said smoothly, lifting a single sheet of parchment from her reticule. "Only that those who traffic in falsehoods often do so to distract from their own unfortunate entanglements." She handed the letter to a woman nearby, one of Lydia's closest confidants. The lady read. Her eyes widened. The page passed from one gloved hand to the next. Whispers rose, low, stunned, precise. Affairs, debts, misrepresented inheritances, all traced back to Lydia. The crimson in her dress suddenly looked garish, almost theatrical. "I would suggest," Eleanor said, "that those who live in glass parlours avoid casting stones." Lydia turned, face pale with rage, and disappeared through the nearest door. Gideon's hand remained steady in Alison's. He looked down at her. "Shall we?" And together they crossed the room. Not as rumour and shadow, not as scandal and benefactor, but as man and woman, walking side by side through the very space that had tried to erase her. In the farthest corner of the room, Margaret Whitcombe stood partially obscured by a marble pillar. She had watched everything, her eyes narrowed, her lips bloodless. But when Eleanor's words turned the tide, and the crowd bent around her daughter instead of shunning her, something inside Margaret cracked. She slipped from the ballroom in silence. She would not be back. And inside the hall, as the music resumed with hesitant grace, Alisson stood beneath the chandeliers, no longer trembling, no longer running. For the first time she was not merely being seen, she was being claimed by truth, by courage, and by a man who had once believed himself too broken to offer anything real. And across the room, Eleanor raised her glass, her gaze never leaving the girl who had once entered her home as no one. Now she was something else entirely. Now she was becoming unforgettable. Morning arrived not with fanfare, but with a hush, a stillness that seemed to coat the rose-covered estate in soft light and quieter thoughts. Outside the Pembroke windows, the gardens stirred with the breeze, and the sea, though distant, exhaled against the cliffs like the slow breath of fate. Alisson stood near the tall window in the drawing-room, wrapped in a pale shawl Eleanor had given her, her eyes fixed not on the view, but on her reflection faintly mirrored in the glass. She looked at herself differently now, not as the laundress's daughter, nor the servant-turned-guest, but as something still unnamed, still forming. Behind her, a presence entered so silently she only turned when she felt it, not heard it. Gideon stood a few steps away, his coat still unbuttoned from the early stroll he had not yet taken. His face, half shadowed by the morning light, held that same mixture of gravity and tenderness he reserved only for her. "I have no speech," he said simply. Alisson said nothing. She could feel her heart still, not out of fear, but to listen. No grand gesture, no kneeling. "But I have this question, and I will ask it only once." His voice trembled ever so slightly, not with uncertainty, but with the weight of what it meant to give another person a part of yourself. "Will you stand beside me?" Gideon said, "with your name or mine?" The room held its breath. The clock did not chime. The trees outside did not rustle. Only Alisson moved, slowly turning to face him fully, her expression not startled, not overwhelmed, but calm, fierce in its clarity. "I will stand beside you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I will do so as Alisson Whitcombe." A silence passed between them. He did not blink. He did not question. "I was given that name by a woman who tried to make it mean servitude," she continued, stepping closer to him now. "But it is mine. I have carried it through shame and silence. Now I want to carry it through strength and choice." Gideon lowered his head slightly, not as a sign of disagreement, but of reverence. When he looked up again, his eyes were bright with something unspoken, something like pride. "Then, Alisson Whitcombe, you shall remain," he said, and there was no bitterness in it. Only truth, only peace. That afternoon, Eleanor summoned her to the sewing room. The space smelled of lavender and linen starch, and the old velvet curtains held back the light as though the room had slipped away from the world's scrutiny. "I had these made some weeks ago," Eleanor murmured, handing her a soft parcel wrapped in ivory cloth. "I had a feeling." Alisson opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, folded with gentle care, were handkerchiefs, napkins, and a set of fine bed linen, each embroidered with small, elegant initials, A.W. "I did not expect you to take his name," Eleanor added gently, watching her reaction. "But I embroidered your initials anyway, because I hoped you would remember who you are." Alisson pressed the fabric to her face, overcome with an emotion she could not name. Not gratitude, not relief. Something deeper, an acknowledgement that someone had seen her not as a passing guest, but as a permanent presence. But the quiet joy of the day was not to last. Just before dusk, when the shadows of the house grew long and the lanterns had not yet been lit, a knock echoed through the front door. Henry answered, and Alisson, descending the stairs with a book in hand, froze as she saw Margaret Whitcombe step inside. Her mother looked as she always had, upright in posture, bitter in mouth, but her dress was no longer neat, her gloves worn at the fingertips, and her eyes slightly sunken. She carried a small satchel tucked under her arm, and a folded document clutched like a weapon. "I come with business," she announced, eyes sweeping past Henry to land on Alisson. "For Mr. Pembroke and Miss Whitcombe." Henry hesitated, but Alisson spoke first. "Bring her to the study," she said. Her voice did not shake. Eleanor was already waiting there, as if fate had warned her. Gideon stood by the fireplace when they entered, unmoving. Margaret barely glanced at him before placing the satchel on the table and removing its contents with a practiced flourish. Letters, documents, debt notes with forged signatures, all carefully laid out like traps in a snare. "I have here proof," Margaret declared, "that you owe me for every bit of comfort you've given my daughter. And unless I'm compensated generously, I shall go to the courts and to the society pages with a tale of what your household has done to an innocent girl." "Innocent?" Eleanor said, her voice smooth as still water. How strange, then, that an innocent woman would forge her daughter's signature on debt documents and letters of service abandonment. Margaret turned. Eleanor reached into her own satchel and laid out her answer. Notarized evidence, witness testimonies, bank statements, and letters contradicting every accusation. "We've been prepared for some time," she added calmly. "And now, so are the authorities, should you wish to continue." Margaret faltered. Gideon, until then silent, stepped forward, not with threat, but finality. "You no longer have power here," he said softly. "Not over Alisson. Not over this house." Alisson said nothing, but she stepped between Margaret and the others, facing her mother not with hate, but with weary mercy. "You taught me silence," she said, "but I've unlearned it. You taught me fear, but I've left it behind. There's nothing more to take from me." Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. She gathered her satchel in hands that now trembled, and for the first time in Alisson's memory, Margaret did not argue. She did not curse. She simply left. The door closed behind her with the softest click, not dramatic, not vengeful, but final. That evening the household was quiet. No one spoke of the visit. The fire in the drawing room crackled gently, and Eleanor sat by the window, embroidering new napkins. Gideon found Alisson in the study, the same place where her name had been claimed and protected hours before. She sat by the fire, holding the linen marked A.W. in her lap. He did not speak. He only sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, close but not touching, and for the first time since she had entered his house, she leaned her head gently against him. No words, no promises, only the shared weight of what had been shed and what had been earned. That night, the Pembroke estate did not sleep in fear or tension, but in the deep stillness of justice finally served, and of a woman who would carry her name not as a burden, but as a banner. The morning of the wedding bloomed with such softness that even the sea seemed to hush its rhythm. A delicate fog clung to the tops of the hedgerows, and the rose trees along the edge of the Pembroke gardens had burst into full bloom, as if they too had been waiting for this day. Summer had arrived not with heat and noise, but with grace, quiet, fragrant, and full of promise. Alisson awoke before the bells of the kitchen stirred and before Eleanor's steps echoed in the corridor. She stood barefoot at the window, wrapped in a pale robe, embroidered at the cuff, with the initials that now felt entirely her own, A.W. The initials did not symbolize possession, but transformation. In the mirror, she barely recognized the girl who once flinched at her mother's knock, who walked with her eyes lowered. That girl had not vanished. No, she had been folded into this version of herself like the lining of a gown, hidden but essential. Her name had not changed, but everything else had. Later that morning, Eleanor entered the room carrying a modest bundle. "You're not meant to wear anything grand," she said softly, "but you're meant to wear something of meaning." Alisson opened the package and smiled. The gown was ivory, made of soft lawn cotton and silk thread. There was no corset, no lace frills, no satin train to drag behind her. The bodice was smooth and fitted, the sleeves short and gently puffed, the hem skimming just above her ankles. There were no diamonds, no veils, only a single pressed flower sewn into the waistline, a dried forget-me-not. It was the flower Gideon had left for her once, beside a book of poetry, when she could not read a single word. Eleanor helped fasten the last button. "This dress," she whispered, "is not what society expects. It's what you chose. And that is what makes it bridal." In the garden, beneath the rose trees whose branches formed a loose canopy of petals, Gideon waited. He wore a dark frock coat and a dove-grey waistcoat, his cravat neatly tied but without ornament. His scarred face was neither hidden nor emphasized. His stance, upright and still, was not that of a man receiving a bride, but one meeting her as an equal, as one survivor greets another. Henry stood at his side, his usually brisk demeanor softened by emotion he did not know how to express. "Doctor." Marshall arrived soon after, adjusting his spectacles as he watched the scene with the care of a man who had seen far too much suffering to take joy for granted. Then came the sound of footsteps across the garden path. Everyone turned. Alisson approached without fanfare. She held no bouquet. Her hair was swept back, pinned with a single silver comb. The light wind lifted the edges of her skirt, and for a moment the world around her blurred into fragrance and warmth. Gideon did not smile, but his eyes, those storm-colored eyes, widened as if they were seeing her for the very first time. When she reached him, they did not take hands immediately. They simply looked at one another. The vows were brief. There was no priest, no long sermon. Eleanor spoke the only words that mattered. "Let this union not bind, but free," she said, her voice thick with tears. "Let it be the choice of two souls, not the merging of names or fortunes. Let it be seen." And it was. They exchanged simple rings. Gideon slid the gold band onto her finger with a reverence that made the act feel sacred. Alisson pressed the ring onto his hand, as if sealing a promise she had waited her whole life to give. When it was done, there was no applause. Only quiet, a reverent silence that felt heavier than sound. At the small reception held beneath a white canvas pavilion, the household gathered. Cook wept unabashedly into her apron. The footman stood straighter than ever. Henry, for the first time, raised a glass in toast. Eleanor dabbed her eyes and handed Alisson a small book, the poetry volume once left unread, now marked with ribbon. Alisson stood and opened it. Her voice did not tremble. She read a short passage about resilience, about the flower that grows not in sunlight, but in shadow. When she finished, she closed the book and turned to the guests. "I was born into silence," she said, her voice steady. and he gave me back my voice." She did not look at Gideon as she said it. She looked forward, as if the words had to be spoken not for him, but for herself, for the girl she had been, for the woman she had become. Later, as they walked together down the garden path, petals floated around them like blessings. They walked not arm in arm, but side by side. No one saw the scars anymore. No one saw the rags, the burns, the gossip, the rooms of whispered judgment. What they saw was the woman who had stood before them, with her name, her voice, and her dignity intact, and the man who had seen all of that before anyone else dared. From the second-floor window, Eleanor watched them disappear beyond the hedges, her fingers resting lightly on the windowsill. "She didn't become a Pembroke," she whispered to herself. "She became Alisson." The rose trees bloomed earlier that year. It was the kind of summer that lingered long past its welcome, where the sea air carried not only salt, but stories. The garden at Pembroke House had changed little in 8 years. The ivy had crept higher along the stone walls, the oak bench beneath the rose arbour had aged and silvered, but the laughter that echoed through the grounds had grown bolder, louder, fuller. From the upper window, Eleanor watched the scene below with a cup of tea warming her palms. Her hair, now a crown of snow-white waves, was pulled back in its usual twist. She had refused spectacles for decades, but age had finally convinced her. The gold-rimmed pair now rested on the bridge of her nose, lending her the air of a kindly magistrate. Below, on the sun-dappled grass, a boy and a girl tumbled in mock battle over a basket of plums. The girl was 9, with dark curls and fierce grey eyes. The boy, just 6, had his mother's hazel gaze and a wildness in his legs that not even a morning of chores had tamed. Alisson called out from the veranda, "Rosie, Thomas, leave some for supper, I beg you." Rosalind ignored her and reached again. Thomas giggled, plum juice staining his shirt, his fingers sticky with mischief. Alisson stepped down barefoot into the grass, her skirts gathered in one hand, a linen cloth tossed over her shoulder. Her hair was streaked now with sun-kissed strands, and though the years had traced faint lines at the corners of her mouth, her expression held the same resolute softness it had the day she walked that garden path in a simple wedding gown. Gideon appeared beside her, his hand gently brushing against hers as he passed her the forgotten basket. His hair was more salt than coal now, the scar on his face unchanged, but softened by the years. Time had not erased his solemnity, but it had given it a new name, peace. He bent to scoop up Thomas, who shrieked with laughter. Alisson caught Eleanor's gaze from above, and they exchanged the quiet look only women who have survived storms can share. Gratitude without words. Inside the house, the parlour walls bore new portraits. Not the stiff oil paintings of aristocrats past, but sketches done in charcoal and ink. One depicted Alisson reading to a much younger Rosie on the floor of the library. Another showed Gideon with a book in one hand and Thomas asleep in the crook of his arm. A framed linen square hung quietly near the door, A.W., still embroidered in Eleanor's careful hand. The Pembroke name remained respected in Newport society, but it was no longer whispered with fear or fascination. Eleanor had ensured that Alisson was not just accepted but honoured. Her patronage of orphan literacy programs, women's guilds, and fair-wage domestic work had changed conversations in drawing rooms from idle gossip to admiration. And Gideon, once the reclusive widower of scandalous law, had become something rarer than powerful. He had become kind. Not all reputations had endured. Lydia Harcourt's ambitions curdled into bitterness after her efforts to marry into wealth failed. Her final scandal, an attempt to blackmail a Boston industrialist's son, led to quiet exile in a boarding house in Providence, where her name no longer drew invitations. Her downfall, like Margaret Whitcomb's years before, had come not in fire or fury, but in silence. Dr. Marshall continued to visit, though his hair had thinned and his temper shortened. He never stopped scolding Gideon for reading in low light or allowing Thomas to climb trees in his good shoes. Henry Caldwell retired after 25 years of service. At his farewell supper, he stood in front of the entire household, took a slow breath and raised his glass to Alisson. "You changed everything," he said, "and you never even raised your voice." Alisson looked at Gideon then, and his hand found hers beneath the tablecloth. And so the years had passed, not always gently, not always easily, but truthfully. Every summer, on the same day they had married, Alisson placed a new pressed flower in the pages of the book of poetry that now sat on her bedside table. Not because she was sentimental, but because each bloom marked a year in which her voice had remained her own. That evening, as twilight curled its fingers across the sky and the children were finally asleep, Gideon and Alisson sat on the garden bench beneath the rose arbor. They did not speak. They did not need to. He reached into his pocket and handed her something. It was a forget-me-not, fresh, just picked, still dewy. She looked down at it, then at him, and smiled. "I never forgot," he said quietly. And she, with her hand resting over his, whispered, "You gave me back more than my name, Gideon." Their foreheads touched. The garden darkened around them. The roses held their breath. And in the stillness of that summer night, the woman once born into silence and the man once broken by flame sat side by side, whole, seen, and never again alone. And so, dear listener, we reach the final page of Alisson and Gideon's unforgettable journey. A story not just of love, but of dignity reclaimed, of silence broken, and of courage that bloomed where no one thought it could. What can we take from their story? Perhaps the reminder that true love does not rescue, it recognizes. That healing doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from transforming its weight into strength. That no scar, whether seen or hidden, makes us unworthy of being chosen, cherished, or heard. If you stayed with us until the very end, write the word voice in the comments. It will be our quiet signal, a whisper among friends, that this story touched your heart. If you believe stories like this deserve to reach more people, and if it's within your means, we kindly invite you to support the team behind these tales by sending a super thanks here on YouTube in any amount that feels right for you. Your generosity helps us keep creating deeply emotional, beautifully crafted stories like this one. But if you can't support us that way right now, don't worry. Sharing this story with someone who loves historical romance is also a wonderful gift. And if your heart is still longing for more, I've left links to other moving, romantic period dramas in the cards. You might just find your next favorite there. Thank you for letting us be part of your day, and for allowing this story to live on in your heart.